The autumn leaves danced in the wind as Michael Chen stood before the mirror, adjusting his tie for the 100th time. His hands trembled slightly, not from the cool October breeze flowing through the window, but from the weight of what lay ahead. Tonight, he would introduce the love of his life, Olivia, to his future father-in-law, Richard Thompson, at the city's most prestigious restaurant. Michael had achieved remarkable success as a cardiac surgeon at just 32, saving countless lives with his skilled hands. Yet tonight, those same steady hands that had performed countless delicate surgeries couldn't seem to get his tie straight. The irony wasn't lost on him. 3 years ago, he'd met Olivia at a hospital fundraiser. She was a brilliant pediatrician whose warm smile and genuine compassion for her patients had captured his heart instantly. Their shared dedication to healing others created an unbreakable bond, and their love had grown deeper with each passing day. But there was one shadow that loomed over their happiness: Olivia's father, Richard. A self-made business tycoon who'd built his empire from nothing, Richard had very specific ideas about his daughter's future. He'd never met Michael, but their phone conversations had been cordial, if somewhat distant. Michael had carefully avoided sending any recent photos or meeting in person, focusing instead on building a connection through their shared interests in business and medicine. "Are you ready?" Olivia's voice called from the bedroom. She appeared in the doorway, stunning in an elegant black dress, her natural hair styled perfectly. Her warm brown eyes met his in the mirror, and she could read the anxiety on his face. "Hey, it's going to be okay," she said softly, coming to stand beside him. "Dad will love you once he gets to know you." Michael wished he could share her optimism. He'd heard the stories about Richard Thompson's traditional values and his previous reactions to Olivia's dating choices. The whispered conversations between Olivia and her mother, the subtle warnings from family friends, they all painted a picture that made his stomach churn. As they drove to the restaurant, Michael's mind wandered to the small velvet box hidden in his apartment. Inside was a vintage engagement ring that had belonged to his grandmother, a woman who'd overcome her own struggles with prejudice after immigrating to America. He'd planned to propose to Olivia next week during a romantic weekend getaway, but everything hinged on tonight's dinner. The restaurant's valet took their car, and Michael helped Olivia out, their breath visible in the crisp evening air. Through the restaurant's windows, he could see Richard Thompson already seated at their reserved table, checking his watch. The businessman's imposing figure was exactly as Olivia had described: tall, distinguished, with silver hair and an air of authority that commanded respect. "Remember," Olivia squeezed his hand. "You're an incredible doctor who saves lives every day. That's what matters." Her words were meant to comfort, but they both knew that in Richard Thompson's world, things weren't that simple. As they approached the table, Michael could see the moment Richard spotted them. The businessman's welcoming smile froze, his eyes widening slightly as they fixed on Michael. The crystal glass in his hand paused halfway to his lips, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Michael had faced many challenging moments in his career, split-second decisions in the operating room, delivering both good news and bad to patients' families. But nothing had prepared him for the cold fury that slowly spread across Richard Thompson's face. "Daddy," Olivia started, her voice strong despite the tension, "this is Michael Chen, the man I've been telling you about. The one I'm going to dash." "No." Richard's voice cut through the air like a steel blade. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. Several nearby diners turned to look. "Absolutely not. This is not happening." Michael stepped forward, extending his hand. "Mr. Thompson, I know this might be unexpected, but if you'll just give me a chance to dash." "A chance?" Richard's laugh was harsh, devoid of humor. "You deliberately deceived me. Both of you." He turned to Olivia, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Is this some kind of rebellion? After everything I've given you, everything I've worked for?" Olivia's fingers tightened around Michael's arm. "Daddy, please. Michael is a brilliant surgeon. He's kind, successful, and he makes me happier than I've ever been. If you'd just listen. I've heard enough. Richard threw his napkin on the table and reached for his coat. When you're ready to have a serious conversation about your future, you know where to find me. He paused, looking directly at Michael for the first time. And you, stay away from my daughter. As Richard stormed out of the restaurant, leaving a wake of whispers and stares, Michael felt Olivia trembling beside him. He turned to her, seeing tears threatening to spill from her eyes, and pulled her close. Around them, the restaurant had gone quietly uncomfortable, other diners pretending not to notice the scene that had just unfolded. I'm so sorry, Olivia whispered against his chest. I really thought he'd be different this time. Michael held her tighter, his mind racing. He'd known this wouldn't be easy, but the reality was far worse than he'd imagined. What he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that this disastrous dinner would set in motion a chain of events that would change not only their lives but Richard Thompson's entire worldview in ways none of them could have predicted. The following week passed in a blur of tense phone calls and tearful conversations. Michael threw himself into his work at the hospital, performing surgery after surgery as if saving enough lives could somehow fix the broken pieces of his personal life. His colleagues noticed the change in him, the longer hours, the extra consultations, the way his usual warm smile had been replaced by a focused determination. One evening, as he was reviewing patient files in his office, his phone buzzed with a message from Olivia, "Dad's cutting me off. Froze my accounts. Says it's for my own good." Michael's hands clenched around the phone, his jaw tight. He'd been raised to believe that success and hard work could overcome any obstacle, but Richard Thompson seemed determined to prove him wrong. Olivia had moved in with Michael temporarily, her father's ultimatum having made her childhood home unbearable. Her mother, Grace Thompson, secretly called every few days, torn between loyalty to her husband and love for her daughter. "He's just shocked," Grace would say, her voice tinged with both hope and uncertainty. "Give him time. He needs time." But time seemed to be making things worse. Richard had started calling their mutual colleagues, suggesting that perhaps Michael wasn't the best fit for certain medical conferences and committees. It was never anything overt, just subtle hints and carefully worded concerns about his judgment and character. Late one night, after a particularly challenging surgery, Michael found himself sitting in the hospital chapel. He wasn't particularly religious, but something about the quiet space helped him think. An elderly janitor named Joe was mopping the floors, humming softly to himself. "Heavy thoughts for a late hour, Doc?" Joe asked, leaning on his mop. Michael looked up, managing a small smile. "Just trying to figure out how to change someone's heart when they've already decided who you are based on how you look." Joe nodded thoughtfully, pulling up a chair. "You know, I've been working in this hospital for 40 years. Seen all kinds of people come through these doors. Pain, fear, prejudice, they don't care what color you are or where you come from. Neither does healing." As they talked, Joe shared stories of his own experiences during the civil rights movement, of how he'd seen both the worst and best of humanity in this very hospital. "Sometimes," he said, "people need a mirror held up to their own hearts before they can see the truth." The conversation with Joe planted a seed in Michael's mind. The next day, he made a decision. If Richard Thompson wanted to judge him, then he'd have to do it based on who he really was, not just what he looked like. He began documenting every surgery, every life saved, every family comforted. He reached out to patients whose lives he'd touched over the years, asking them to share their stories. Not to brag, but to show the truth of who he was, a healer, a man who had dedicated his life to saving others. Olivia supported his efforts while fighting her own battles. She continued her work at the pediatric ward, her patients' parents unaware of the family drama that followed her home each night. But the strain was showing. She'd lost weight, and dark circles had formed under her eyes. One afternoon, while Michael was preparing for surgery, his phone lit up with an urgent message from Grace Thompson. Richard had collapsed at his office and was being rushed to the hospital, their hospital. Michael's hospital. What do we do? Olivia asked when he called her, her voice shaking. Dad specifically told his company to take him to this hospital because it's the best cardiac center in the state. He doesn't know you're on call today. Michael looked at the emergency room updates coming through on his tablet. The symptoms were clear. Richard Thompson was having a major cardiac event. The kind that Michael had specialized in treating, the kind that required immediate intervention by the most skilled surgeon available. We do our jobs, Michael said firmly. We save lives. That's who we are. He rushed to the emergency room, arriving just as the ambulance pulled up. Richard Thompson lay on the stretcher, his face gray, his usual commanding presence diminished by pain and fear. Their eyes met for a brief moment as Richard was wheeled in, and Michael saw the flash of recognition, followed by something else, panic. The attending physician quickly briefed Michael on the situation. Richard needed emergency surgery, and he was the best qualified surgeon available. The next few minutes were crucial. Grace arrived at the hospital, breathless and terrified. When she saw Michael in his surgical scrubs, her eyes widened. You're going to operate on Richard? Mrs. Thompson, Michael said gently, I'm the most experienced cardiac surgeon on call. Your husband needs immediate surgery, and this is what I do. This is who I am. Before heading into the operating room, Michael found Olivia in the waiting area. She stood up when she saw him, her face a mixture of fear and hope. Can you save him? She whispered. Michael took her hands in his. I'm going to do everything I can. Not because he's your father, not because I have anything to prove, but because this is my calling. This is why I became a doctor. As he scrubbed in for surgery, Michael thought about the small velvet box still hidden in his apartment, about the future he dreamed of with Olivia, about the father-in-law who had judged him without knowing him. In a few moments, he would hold Richard Thompson's heart in his hands, not metaphorically, but literally. The irony wasn't lost on him. Scalpel, he said calmly as he stood over the operating table, looking down at the unconscious face of the man who had tried to destroy his relationship with Olivia. The room fell silent, waiting for him to begin. In that moment, Michael Chen wasn't thinking about race, prejudice, or family drama. He was thinking about vessel grafts, blood flow, and the precise movements that would mean the difference between life and death. Because that's what really mattered, not the color of his skin, but the skill of his hands and the knowledge in his mind. The surgery would take hours, and its outcome would change everything, though not in the way any of them expected. 7 hours. That's how long Michael stood over the operating table, his world narrowed to the intricate landscape of vessels and tissue beneath his hands. The surgery was complex, more complex than the initial assessment had suggested. Twice, Richard's heart had shown signs of distress, and twice, Michael's experience and quick thinking had pulled him back from the brink. As he finally stepped out of the operating room, exhaustion weighing heavy on his shoulders, Michael found both Olivia and Grace waiting anxiously. Their faces turned to him simultaneously, eyes searching for any hint of the news he carried. He's stable, Michael said, his voice hoarse from the hours of concentrated silence. The surgery was complicated, but successful. The next 24 hours will be critical, but I'm cautiously optimistic. Grace burst into tears, while Olivia closed her eyes in relief. Then, to Michael's surprise, Grace stepped forward and hugged him tightly. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for saving my husband, even after everything. As Grace went to call other family members, Olivia pulled Michael aside. There's something you need to know, she said, her voice low and urgent. While you were in surgery, Mom was going through Dad's office, looking for his medical information. She found something that changes everything. Before she could continue, a nurse called Michael away for post-operative instructions. Later, he promised, squeezing Olivia's hand. But the look in her eyes stayed with him, a mixture of shock, confusion, and something else he couldn't quite read. The next morning, after a few hours of restless sleep in the on-call room, Michael went to check on his patient. As he approached Richard's room in the ICU, he heard voices, Grace and an older man he didn't recognize. "You can't keep this secret anymore, Grace," the man was saying. "Not after what's happened. Richard needs to know the truth about his own father." Michael knew he shouldn't eavesdrop, but something in the urgent tone of their conversation made him pause outside the door. "Uncle Walter, please," Grace pleaded. "This isn't the right time. He's barely out of surgery." "Then when is the right time?" the man, Uncle Walter, responded. "When he's destroyed his relationship with his daughter? When he's pushed away a brilliant young man who just saved his life? All because of prejudices born from lies?" Michael moved away from the door, his mind spinning. What lies? What truth about Richard's father? He found himself walking to the hospital's records room, drawn by a nagging suspicion. The elderly records keeper, Mrs. Chen, no relation, had known Michael since his residency days. "Looking for something specific, doctor?" she asked as he entered. "Yes," Michael replied slowly. "I need to look at some old records. From about 50 years ago." As he searched through the archived files, a story began to emerge, one that made his heart race with its implications. But before he could fully process what he'd found, his pager buzzed. Richard was awake. When Michael entered the ICU room, Richard's eyes were open, though clouded with pain and medication. Grace sat beside him, holding his hand, while Uncle Walter stood by the window, his expression troubled. Olivia had just arrived, still in her doctor's coat from her morning rounds. "Mr. Thompson," Michael said professionally, moving to check the monitors. "How are you feeling?" Richard's voice was weak but clear. "Like someone cracked open my chest and rewired my heart." He paused, looking at Michael with an unreadable expression. "Which is exactly what you did, isn't it?" The room was thick with tension. Michael proceeded with his examination, explaining the surgery and recovery process in detail. As he spoke, he could feel Richard watching him intently, as if seeing him for the first time. "Why?" Richard finally asked. Michael stopped his examination. "Why what, Mr. Thompson? Why did you save me? After how I treated you, you could have let another surgeon take the case. No one would have blamed you." The room fell silent. Even the steady beep of the heart monitor seemed to fade into the background as Michael considered his response. "Because that's not who I am," he said simply. "When I took my oath as a doctor, it wasn't with conditions or exceptions. Every life is precious, every heart worth saving, regardless of what that person might think of me." Tears appeared in Grace's eyes, and Uncle Walter moved closer to the bed. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, they were glistening. "There's something you need to know," Grace said suddenly, her voice trembling. "Something we found while you were in surgery." She pulled out an old, worn envelope from her bag. "It's about your father, your real father." Richard's monitor showed a slight spike in heart rate. "What are you talking about?" "My father died when I was 2. I barely remember him." Uncle Walter stepped forward. "That's not entirely true, Richard. The man who raised you, my brother, he wasn't your biological father. Your real father." He paused, looking at Michael. "Your real father was Dr. James Washington, one of the first black cardiac surgeons in this hospital." The revelation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Richard's face went pale, his hands gripping the hospital sheets. Michael stood frozen, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place, the old records he'd found, the stories he'd heard about Dr. Washington, the pioneering surgeon who had disappeared mysteriously in the 1970s. "That's impossible," Richard whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. Grace gently opened the envelope, pulling out old photographs and letters. "Your mother told me the truth before she died, but made me promise not to tell you unless it was absolutely necessary. She was afraid of how you might react, given your views." As Grace began to explain, Michael's pager buzzed again. Another emergency needed his attention. He excused himself quietly, leaving the Thompson family to process this earth-shattering revelation. But as he walked away, he heard Richard call out, "Dr. Chen." "Michael, wait." Michael turned back. Richard's face was a mask of confusion and pain, but there was something else there too, the beginning of understanding, perhaps even change. "Thank you," Richard said softly. "Not just for saving my life, but for showing me what kind of man you really are. I think I have a lot to learn." As Michael headed to his next patient, he realized that sometimes the greatest surgeries weren't just about healing bodies, they were about healing hearts and minds too. And sometimes, the truth that could change everything was buried not in medical charts or surgical procedures, but in the complex history of our own families. The next few days in the hospital became a journey of discovery that none of them had expected. Richard spent hours poring over the old letters and photographs Grace had brought, his hands trembling as he traced the features of a father he'd never known. The resemblance was unmistakable, the same strong jawline, the same determined set of the eyes. One afternoon, as Michael came to check on his recovery, he found Richard studying a particularly worn photograph. It showed a young Dr. James Washington standing proudly in front of the hospital, his white coat crisp against the black and white background. "He stood right where you stand now," Richard said quietly, not looking up. "Saving lives, facing prejudice, probably dealing with people just like." His voice broke. "Just like I've been." Michael pulled up a chair, sensing that this wasn't just a routine checkup anymore. The monitors showed Richard's vital signs were stable, giving them space for this conversation. "Tell me about him," Richard said. "You must have heard stories about Dr. Washington during your training here." Michael nodded slowly. "He was a pioneer. One of the first black surgeons to perform open-heart surgery in this hospital. The older nurses still talk about his dedication, how he'd worked through the night to save patients that other doctors had given up on." He paused. "They also talk about how he disappeared suddenly in 1972, leaving behind a legacy of medical innovations but so many unanswered questions." Richard's hands clenched around the photograph. "He didn't disappear," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "According to these letters, he was forced to leave. The hospital board at the time, they threatened to expose his relationship with my mother. She was already married to Uncle Walter's brother, and in those days, the scandal would have destroyed both their lives," Michael finished softly. "So he left. Gave up everything he'd worked for. The letters stopped coming after a while. Mother never told me, she let me believe." Richard's voice cracked with emotion. "I grew up hating what I am." Olivia had entered the room quietly during their conversation. She moved to her father's bedside, taking his hand. The gesture seemed to break something open in Richard, and tears began rolling down his cheeks. "All these years," he continued, "I built walls around myself. Created this image of success, of control. I thought I was protecting our family's legacy, our place in society. But I was just perpetuating the same prejudice that drove my real father away." As if drawn by the weight of the moment, Grace and Uncle Walter joined them. The small hospital room felt charged with decades of unspoken truths and buried emotions. "There's more," Grace said gently, pulling another envelope from her bag. "We found these in the hospital archives. Dr. Washington didn't just leave, he continued his work in a small clinic in Chicago. He never stopped helping people, never stopped saving lives." Michael watched as Richard opened the new envelope with shaking hands. Inside were newspaper clippings, documenting the work of a free clinic in one of Chicago's poorest neighborhoods. Dr. Washington's face, older but still recognizable, appeared in several photos, surrounded by grateful patients and their families. "He died last year," Uncle Walter added softly. "The clinic still operates, renamed in his honor. They say he worked until the very end, refusing to retire even when his health began to fail." Richard closed his eyes, overwhelmed. When he opened them again, he looked directly at Michael. "I spent my whole life running from who I am, building walls to protect myself from truths I didn't want to face. And then you came along, a brilliant surgeon, just like my father, pushing through barriers, saving lives, saving my life." Olivia squeezed her father's hand, tears streaming down her face. "Daddy. I was so wrong," Richard continued. "About everything. About you, Michael. About what really matters in this world." He turned to his daughter. "Can you ever forgive me?" Before Olivia could respond, a commotion in the hallway drew their attention. Mrs. Chen, the elderly records keeper, appeared at the door, clutching a dusty box. "Dr. Chen," she called out, excitement in her voice. "I found it. In the old storage room behind the files. Dr. Washington's personal effects, things he left behind when he had to leave." Michael helped bring the box to Richard's bedside. Inside were journals, old medical notes, and something that made Richard gasp, a small, worn leather case containing a stethoscope. "His favorite instrument," Mrs. Chen explained. "He used to say he could hear not just the heart's rhythm, but its story." She smiled at Richard. He was a lot like Dr. Chen here, always believing in the power of healing to bridge any divide. As they went through the box together, a fuller picture of Dr. James Washington emerged, not just as a pioneering surgeon, but as a man who had faced impossible choices with dignity and courage. His detailed medical notes revealed innovative techniques that were ahead of their time, some of which Michael realized he used in his own practice without knowing their origin. "Look at this," Olivia said, pulling out a sealed envelope from the bottom of the box. It was addressed simply, "For my son, when he's ready to understand." Richard stared at the envelope, his heart monitor showing a slight increase in rhythm. Michael moved to check his vitals, but Richard waved him off. "I'm okay," he said. "For the first time in a long time, I think I'm really okay." As Richard held the unopened letter from his father, Michael realized that sometimes the greatest healings happened not in the operating room, but in these quiet moments of truth and reconciliation. The monitors beeped steadily, marking not just the rhythm of Richard's recovering heart, but the pulse of a family's transformation. What none of them knew yet was that the letter in Richard's hands would contain revelations that would shake their world even further, connecting past and present in ways none of them could have imagined. The hospital room fell silent as Richard held the letter from his biological father. His hands trembled so much that Grace gently took the envelope, carefully opening it to preserve its aged seal. Inside was a handwritten letter, the ink slightly faded but still clearly legible, along with what appeared to be old newspaper clippings and a small key. "Would you like me to read it?" Grace asked softly. Richard nodded, unable to find his voice. "My dearest son," Grace began reading, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "If you're reading this, then you've finally learned the truth about your heritage, about who you really are. I've written this letter 1,000 times in my head over the years, but now that I'm putting pen to paper, I find myself struggling to find the right words." Richard closed his eyes, listening to his father's words come alive through Grace's voice. "First, you must know that leaving you was the hardest decision I ever made. Your mother and I knew that in 1970s America, our love would bring nothing but pain and suffering to everyone involved, especially you. The world wasn't ready for us then. I pray it's readier now." Michael moved to leave, feeling like an intruder on this intensely private moment, but Richard's hand shot out, gripping his arm. "Stay," he whispered. "Please." Grace continued reading, I've watched you from afar all these years, tracking your successes, your achievements. I saw you graduate from business school in the newspaper. I kept every article about your company's growth. I was there, in the back row of your wedding to Grace, though I left before anyone could notice me. My heart broke when I saw you building walls around yourself, adopting the very prejudices that tore our family apart. Olivia wiped tears from her eyes as her grandmother read on. But I never lost hope that someday you would learn the truth and understand that the very diversity you've grown to fear is what gave you life. Your mother was the bravest person I ever knew, defying her family, society, everything she'd been taught, for love. She made me promise to keep our secret until after her passing, to protect you from the judgment of a world that wasn't ready to accept the truth. Grace paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. There's something else you need to know. The key enclosed with this letter opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank, box number 1972. Inside, you'll find documentation of a trust one established for you, funded by patents from my medical innovations. I never stopped working to secure your future, even from afar. But more importantly, you'll find evidence of a medical legacy that I pray hasn't died with me. Richard's eyes flew open, looking at the small key that had fallen from the envelope. In that box, you'll find detailed research notes about a rare genetic heart condition that runs in our family line. I discovered it during my research, but was forced to abandon my work when I left. The condition can skip generations, lying dormant until suddenly manifesting in times of stress. I've watched, helplessly, wondering if you inherited it, unable to warn you directly without revealing everything. Michael straightened, his medical mind racing. The complications during Richard's surgery, the unusual patterns he'd noticed, suddenly everything made sense. The letter continued, if you're reading this, find a doctor you can trust. Someone who'll understand the significance of this research. The condition is manageable with proper care, but only if you know to look for it. I've dedicated my life in Chicago to tracking this condition through other families, building a database that could save lives. That's why the surgery was so complex, Michael said quietly. Your heart showed classic signs of this condition, but without knowing to look for it specifically. He trailed off, realizing the implications. Richard's voice was hoarse. You still saved me, even without knowing about the condition. Just like my father would have done. Grace's hands were shaking slightly as she read the final paragraphs. My greatest regret is not being there to guide you, to show you that character, not color, defines a person's worth. But know this, every life I saved in my clinic, every patient I helped, I did it hoping that someday you would understand that healing knows no boundaries, that love knows no color. My time is growing short now. The clinic keeps me busy, but I can feel my own heart growing weaker. Perhaps it's the same condition that I pray you'll never face. My final wish is that when you learn the truth, it will open your heart, not harden it further. That you'll understand that the blood running through your veins carries a legacy of both struggle and triumph, of love that defied boundaries, and of healing that transcends all differences. With eternal love, your father, Dr. James Washington. P.S. Look in the bottom of the box you found this letter in. There's one more thing I saved for you. Uncle Walter reached into the box, finding a small velvet pouch at the bottom. Inside was a pocket watch, its silver surface engraved with the words, "To heal is to hope, J.W." As Richard held the watch, its weight seeming to carry all the years of separation and silence, Michael's medical training kicked in. We need to run some tests, he said gently. If this condition is genetic, we need to check Olivia too. Dr. Washington's research could be crucial for both of you. Richard looked at the pocket watch, then at Michael, seeing him truly for the first time, not as a threat to his carefully constructed world, but as a continuation of his own father's legacy of healing. Would you? Richard started, then cleared his throat. Would you oversee our care? Both mine and Olivia's? I think. I think my father would have wanted that. The moment was interrupted by Mrs. Chen, who appeared at the door again, her face flushed with excitement. "There's more," she said, holding up another file. "I found Dr. Washington's original research papers. They were misfiled all these years, but..." She looked at Michael. "Dr. Chen, some of his theories about cardiac care, they're exactly what you've been working on in your recent research." As Michael took the file, he realized that medicine, like love, had a way of bridging the gaps between generations, between people, between the past and present. The very techniques he'd used to save Richard's life had their roots in his father's groundbreaking work. What none of them realized yet was that the contents of that safety deposit box would lead them on a journey that would not only protect their family's health but would also help countless others carrying the same genetic legacy. The story of healing was far from over, it was just beginning. The following week brought a flurry of activity as Michael coordinated with the bank to access Dr. Washington's safety deposit box. The morning they went to retrieve its contents, Richard insisted on leaving the hospital against medical advice, though he compromised by using a wheelchair. The bank manager led them into a private room, where Richard's hands shook as he inserted the small key. Inside the box, they found a thick manila envelope, several journals, and a USB drive that looked relatively new, suggesting Dr. Washington had continued updating his research until his final days. "He never stopped thinking about you," Grace said softly, watching Richard examine each item with reverence. The manila envelope contained detailed medical histories spanning 3 generations, including families Dr. Washington had treated in Chicago. The genetic heart condition, which he had named Washington-Mitchell cardiac syndrome, showed a clear pattern of inheritance and stress-related triggers. As Michael reviewed the research, his professional excitement grew. "This is groundbreaking," he said, scanning through the pages. Dr. Washington didn't just identify the condition, he developed a protocol for early detection and management. This could save countless lives. But it was the USB drive that held the most stunning revelation. When they plugged it into Michael's hospital office computer, they found not only decades of research data but also a video file dated just months before Dr. Washington's death. The elderly doctor's face filled the screen, his features so similar to Richard's that it took their breath away. "My son," he began, his voice warm despite its weakness. "If you're watching this, then you've finally learned the truth. There's something else you need to know. Your daughter, my granddaughter, she's a doctor now. I've followed her career from afar, proud beyond words of her dedication to healing." Olivia gasped softly. Her father reached for her hand as the video continued. "I've seen her name in medical journals, read about her work in pediatrics. The same passion for healing that drove me, that I see in you through your business philanthropy, burns bright in her. But she needs to know about our family's medical history. The condition can be particularly dangerous during pregnancy." The room fell silent. Michael turned to Olivia, who had gone pale. They hadn't told anyone yet, but she was 8 weeks pregnant, news they'd planned to share before the disastrous dinner that had started all of this. "How did he know?" Olivia whispered. "The video was made months ago." "He didn't," Michael replied gently. "He was warning you for the future. And now we can make sure you and the baby receive proper care." Richard stared at his daughter, then at Michael, the implications of everything hitting him at once. He was going to be a grandfather. The same genetic legacy that had nearly taken his life could affect his grandchild. And the man he had rejected was not only the one who had saved his life but would now be responsible for protecting his daughter and future grandchild. "There's something else you should see," Mrs. Chen said, entering the office with another file. "I've been going through old hospital records. Dr. Washington didn't just track the condition, he created a network of doctors across the country who could recognize and treat it. Some of them are still practicing." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "We need to revive that network. Update the protocols with modern technology. Your father's work was decades ahead of its time, but now we have the tools to take it further. Richard stood up shakily from his wheelchair, moving to the window. The hospital grounds spread out below, where people of all backgrounds came seeking healing. I want to help, he said suddenly. My company, my resources, we can fund this research. Create a foundation in my father's name. Olivia moved to his side. Daddy. No, listen, Richard turned to face them all. I spent years building walls, judging people based on nothing but their appearance. Meanwhile, my own father was saving lives, building bridges, creating a legacy of healing that could save our own family. It's time I lived up to that legacy. That evening, as Michael reviewed Olivia's initial test results in his office, he found Richard waiting for him. The older man looked different somehow, humbled, but also more at peace. I owe you more than just an apology, Richard said without preamble. I owe you my life, my daughter's future, my grandchild's health. I don't expect you to forgive me. It's not about forgiveness, Michael interrupted gently. It's about healing. All kinds of healing. Richard pulled out his father's pocket watch, running his thumb over the engraved words. To heal is to hope, he read aloud. Then he held it out to Michael. I want you to have this. Michael started to protest, but Richard continued. My father's legacy lives on through your work, through the lives you save. This belongs with someone who truly understands its meaning. As Michael carefully took the watch, Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out something else, the small velvet box he'd found in Michael's apartment while getting some of his things from home. I also found this, he said softly. And I think it's time you used it. Michael stared at the ring box, then at Richard, understanding dawning in his eyes. Life is too short for hatred, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. Too precious for prejudice. My father understood that. It took nearly losing my life for me to understand it too. He pressed the ring box into Michael's hand. Make my daughter happy. Make my grandchild proud. That's all I ask. What they didn't know then was that this moment would mark the beginning of not just a family's healing, but a medical breakthrough that would touch lives far beyond their own. The story of a father's love, hidden for decades in research notes and genetic codes, was about to change modern cardiac care forever. 3 months passed in a whirlwind of activity. The hospital boardroom, once a place of conservative tradition, now buzzed with excitement as Michael presented the groundbreaking research compiled from Dr. Washington's work. Richard sat at the table, no longer just a patient but a passionate advocate, his business acumen helping to transform decades-old research into a modern medical initiative. The Washington Mitchell Cardiac Research Foundation, Richard announced, standing beside Michael as they unveiled the project. Phase 1 will establish screening centers in underserved communities. Phase 2 will create a nationwide network of specialized cardiac care units. His voice swelled with pride as he added, my father's work won't just save our family, it will save generations. The changes weren't just professional. Richard had thrown himself into preparations for the baby, transforming his mansion study into a nursery. The room's walls, once covered with business awards, now displayed framed copies of Dr. Washington's medical illustrations alongside family photographs. One afternoon, as Olivia sat in the newly furnished nursery, running her hands over her growing belly, she found her father standing in the doorway, holding a dusty photo album. I found this in the attic, he said, settling into the rocking chair beside her. Pictures from the hospital's early days. He opened the album, pointing to a photograph of a young black doctor treating a white child. That's him, your grandfather, breaking barriers even then. Olivia leaned closer, studying the image. The child's parents look afraid, she observed. Richard nodded slowly. They were, at first. But look at the next picture. He turned the page to show the same family, smiling with Dr. Washington. He changed their minds by saving their daughter. One heart at a time, one family at a time. The door chimed downstairs, and Grace's voice called up, "Michael's here with the test results." They gathered in the living room, where Michael spread out several charts on the coffee table. "The genetic screening shows the condition is manageable," he explained, pointing to various markers. "We'll need to monitor both you and the baby carefully, Olivia, but Dr. Washington's research has given us a roadmap for treatment." Richard studied the medical charts, remembering how he'd once judged people without knowing their stories, their struggles, their triumphs. Now, looking at the complex genetic patterns that connected him to his father, to his daughter, to his unborn grandchild, he saw how meaningless those superficial judgments had been. "There's something else," Michael said, pulling out a letter. "Remember those doctors in your father's network? One of them is still practicing in Chicago. Dr. Patricia Williams. She was one of the last doctors to work with Dr. Washington at his clinic. She's agreed to come consult with us." The news energized them all. Dr. Williams arrived the following week, a distinguished woman in her 70s who carried herself with quiet confidence. She brought with her a treasure trove of personal notes and memories. "James talked about you constantly," she told Richard over dinner at his home. "He kept a picture of you on his desk, your college graduation photo from the newspaper. Every time he published a paper or made a breakthrough, he'd say, 'My son will understand someday.'" As she shared stories about working with Dr. Washington, Richard learned about another side of his father. The mentor who inspired a generation of young doctors, the healer who treated everyone regardless of their ability to pay, the man who never let bitterness poison his heart despite the injustices he faced. "The week before he died," Dr. Williams continued, her voice softening, "he made me promise to keep his research safe. 'My son will find it when he's ready,' he said. 'When he learns to see with his heart, not just his eyes.'" She looked at Richard meaningfully. "He never lost faith in you." Later that evening, as the family sat in the garden watching the sunset, Michael's phone buzzed with news from the hospital. The first screening center had identified 3 children with early signs of the cardiac condition. Thanks to Dr. Washington's protocols, they would receive treatment before any serious complications developed. "Lives saved before they were even at risk," Olivia said softly, leaning against Michael. "That's Papa James's legacy." Richard watched his daughter and Michael together, seeing not their differences but their shared dedication to healing, their love for each other, their excitement about the future. He thought about how close he'd come to destroying this family before it even began, all because of prejudices he'd inherited from a society his real father had fought to change. Grace brought out Dr. Washington's pocket watch, which Michael now carried during surgeries. The engraved words caught the fading sunlight, "To heal is to hope." "You know what I've learned?" Richard said, breaking the contemplative silence. "Hope isn't just about wishing for better things. It's about having the courage to make them happen. My father hoped for a world where his son would overcome the very prejudices that separated them. He hoped so much that he dedicated his life to leaving breadcrumbs for me to follow when I was ready." He turned to Michael and Olivia. "And now here we are, continuing his work, preparing to welcome a new generation who will never know the barriers he faced. Who will grow up understanding that love and healing transcend all boundaries." Dr. Williams, who had lingered to share more stories, added her own perspective. "James always said that the heart was the great equalizer. In surgery, when you're holding a human heart, you can't tell the race, religion, or status of its owner. You just know it's precious, and your job is to help it keep beating." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they could almost feel Dr. Washington's presence among them, in the genetic code that connected their family, in the medical protocols that would save countless lives, in the love that had finally broken through generations of prejudice. But even as they celebrated these changes, none of them could have predicted the extraordinary event that was about to unfold, an event that would bring Dr. Washington's story full circle in the most unexpected way. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn morning much like the one when this story began, the Washington Mitchell Cardiac Research Center opened its doors. The state-of-the-art facility, built within the hospital where Dr. James Washington had once worked, stood as a testament to how far they'd come. Richard stood at the podium during the opening ceremony, his voice strong despite his emotion. The audience included medical professionals from across the country, many of them doctors who had been part of Dr. Washington's original network. But it was the front row that held his attention, Olivia, now 8 months pregnant, sitting between Michael and Grace, while Dr. Williams watched with proud tears in her eyes. "A year ago," Richard began, "I was a man living in darkness of my own making. I had everything society said was important, wealth, power, influence, but I was blind to what truly mattered." He paused, looking at the large portrait of Dr. James Washington that graced the center's lobby. "I never knew that my real father was a pioneer who broke barriers not with anger or force, but with healing and hope." As Richard spoke, the doors opened and hospital staff began wheeling in patients from the pediatric ward, children of all backgrounds who would be among the first to benefit from the center's advanced screening programs. "These children," Richard continued, gesturing to them, "will never know a world where they're judged by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. They'll be treated by doctors who look like my father, like my son-in-law, like my daughter, doctors who understand that healing knows no boundaries." Suddenly, Olivia grabbed Michael's hand, her face showing a mix of surprise and concern. Grace immediately noticed, and within moments, the private moment had caught everyone's attention. "The baby," Olivia whispered, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Something's not right." The ceremony dissolved into urgent activity. Michael, with the calm efficiency that marked his surgical career, took charge. Within minutes, Olivia was being rushed to the maternal ward, her vital signs showing patterns that Michael recognized from Dr. Washington's research. The genetic heart condition was affecting both mother and child. In the waiting room, Richard paced anxiously, Dr. Washington's pocket watch in his hand. Dr. Williams stayed with them, providing comfort and expertise. James prepared for this, she assured them. His research included specific protocols for labor complications related to the condition. Hours passed in tense waiting. Grace prayed quietly while Richard found himself speaking to his father's portrait in the lobby. "Watch over them," he whispered. "Help us complete your legacy." Finally, Michael emerged from the delivery room, still in his surgical scrubs. His face showed exhaustion but also joy. "They're both fine," he announced. "We had to perform an emergency C-section. But thanks to Dr. Washington's protocols, we knew exactly what to watch for and how to respond." When they were finally allowed to visit, they found Olivia holding a tiny bundle, her face tired but radiant. The baby girl was perfect, her skin a beautiful blend of her parents' tones, her tiny heart beating strong and steady. "We want to name her Jamie," Olivia said softly. "After her great-grandfather." Richard approached the bed carefully, looking down at his granddaughter. In her features, he could see traces of everyone, Michael's nose, Olivia's eyes, and something else, something that reminded him of the photographs of his father. As he held his granddaughter for the first time, a nurse knocked on the door. "Mr. Thompson? There's someone here you need to meet." An elderly man in a wheelchair was guided into the room by Dr. Williams. He was thin and frail, but his eyes were sharp and familiar. "I worked with your father in Chicago," he said to Richard. "I was there the day he performed his last surgery. He made me promise to deliver something to you when the time was right." The man handed Richard an envelope, yellowed with age. Inside was a letter dated just days before Dr. Washington's death, and a small key identical to the one that had opened the safety deposit box. "He knew," the man explained. "Somehow, he knew that when you finally found your way back to his legacy, it would be through love and healing. He left a second safety deposit box, with instructions that it should only be opened when his grandchild was born. Later that evening, after things had settled, Richard and Michael went to the bank. The second box contained a single item, a leather-bound journal with an inscription, "For my granddaughter, who will carry our legacy of healing into a new generation." The journal detailed not just medical observations, but personal hopes and dreams. The final entry read, "To my future grandchild, you are born into a legacy of love that transcended hatred, of healing that overcame prejudice. Your existence proves that barriers can be broken, that hearts can change, that hope never dies. Let your life be a testament to this truth." As they read these words in the hospital room, baby Jamie slept peacefully in her mother's arms. The monitors showed both mother and daughter's hearts beating in perfect rhythm, strong and steady, carrying forward a legacy that had waited decades to be fulfilled. Richard looked around the room, at his daughter, at the son-in-law he'd once rejected but who had saved both his life and his soul, at his perfect granddaughter, and at the portrait of his father visible through the door. The circle was complete. The healing was real. Outside the window, the autumn leaves danced in the wind, just as they had on that fateful night when this story began. But now they seemed to dance with joy rather than anxiety, celebrating a family united, a legacy honored, and love that had finally triumphed over prejudice. And somewhere, they all felt, Dr. James Washington was watching, his dream of healing, both bodies and hearts, finally fulfilled in ways he could only have hoped for.